The orphanage was quiet that evening, its modest walls dimly lit by the fading sunlight sipping through cracks in the curtains. Lily, a 16-year-old girl with striking green eyes and a mop of auburn curls, sat by the window, her favorite spot. She clutched a worn-out diary, one of the few possessions she had, a gift from a kind volunteer who once visited. The pages were filled with dreams, sketches, and fleeting thoughts of a better life. Yet, even as she wrote, a familiar ache in her chest reminded her of the void left by parents she never knew. Today had been a tough day, tougher than usual. A visiting couple, interested in adopting, had spent hours at the orphanage, but their attention never lingered on Lily. She wasn't surprised. Older kids rarely got chosen. Still, watching younger children squeal with excitement as they entertained prospective parents stirred a bittersweet longing in her. Her best friend, Mia, a bubbly girl a year younger, noticed her somber mood. "Lily," Mia called softly, walking over with a cookie she'd saved from lunch. "Don't give up hope. Something amazing will happen for you. I can feel it." Lily forced a smile, appreciating Mia's endless optimism, but she had grown weary of empty reassurances. She returned her gaze to the view outside, where the city skyline loomed in the distance, a world she felt she might never truly belong to. Miles away, in a towering glass building that screamed power and wealth, Ethan Carter, a sharp-suited CEO in his mid-30s, paced his office. Ethan had everything: wealth, success, and the respect of his peers. But his life wasn't as perfect as it appeared. Behind the polished exterior was a man haunted by a choice he'd made years ago, one that seemed to resurface every time he opened his wallet. Inside was a photo, old and creased, of a baby with wide, innocent eyes. He often found himself staring at it, the guilt suffocating him. Tonight was no different. His assistant had just left for the day, and Ethan sank into his chair, running his fingers through his neatly combed dark hair. The photo taunted him, whispering of a past he had tried to bury. Back at the orphanage, life carried on. Dinner was served in the modest dining hall, and the children chatted away, their laughter masking their shared pain. Lily ate quietly, her thoughts elsewhere, when the headmistress, Mrs. Parker, approached her table. "Lily, someone's here to see you," she said gently, her tone laced with mystery. Lily blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Me?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Mrs. Parker nodded, her eyes holding a softness Lily rarely saw. "Yes, he's waiting in the office." Lily's heart raced as she stood, her mind swelling with questions. Who could it be? She wasn't expecting anyone. Walking down the hallway felt like an eternity, each step echoing louder than the last. As she reached the office door, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the knob. When she finally entered, she saw a man standing by the window, his back to her. He turned around, and their eyes met. His face was unfamiliar, yet something about him felt oddly significant. In his hand, he held a photograph. "Lily," the man began, his voice trembling slightly, I need to explain something. Please, give me a moment." Confused, Lily stayed silent, her gaze shifting to the photo. She gasped as recognition struck her like a lightning bolt. It was her as a baby. She had seen that exact photo in the orphanage records, a tiny fragment of her mysterious past. What are you doing with that?" she stammered, her voice cracking. Ethan's usually confident demeanor crumbled. He knelt before her, the weight of his guilt evident in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been carrying this picture for years, and now standing here in front of you, I realize I owe you the truth, and so much more." Lily's mind raced. Who was this man, and why did he have a photo? The questions piled up, each one more pressing than the last. But before she could utter a word, Mrs. Parker gently interrupted. "Perhaps we should all sit down. This is a conversation that deserves time and care." The room felt charged with tension as they settled into their seats. Ethan fidgeted with the photo, his hands shaking slightly. Lily, though desperate for answers, braced herself for whatever revelation was about to unfold. Something told her that this moment would change her life forever. And then Ethan began to speak. Ethan cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on the photograph in his trembling hands. For a man who commanded boardrooms and made life-altering decisions daily, he suddenly seemed small, vulnerable, a far cry from the powerful CEO Lily had imagined him to be. She stared at him, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and guarded hope. "I don't even know where to begin," Ethan said, his voice low and strained. This is something I've carried with me for years, not just the photo, but the weight of what it represents." Lily folded her arms across her chest, unsure whether to feel anger, curiosity, or fear. "You know who I am?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. Ethan nodded, his face shadowed by regret. "Yes, Lily, I do. But I didn't expect—" He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I didn't expect you to be so grown up, so strong." The compliment fell flat in the face of Lily's rising suspicion. "You're not making any sense," she said, her voice firmer now. "How do you have that photo? And why are you here?" Mrs. Parker, sitting nearby, remained silent, her wise, wrinkled face unreadable. She seemed to understand that this was a conversation only Ethan and Lily could navigate, though her presence offered a quiet reassurance to Lily. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he clasped his hands together. "When you were just a baby, my life was different. I was younger, reckless, and selfish. I made choices back then that I've regretted every single day since. Choices that affected people like you." His voice cracked, and he quickly looked away, his jaw tightening. Lily narrowed her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are you trying to say?" she demanded. "Are you saying you knew my parents?" Ethan flinched at her words, guilt flashing across his face. "Yes, I knew them. Your mother, she was someone I cared about deeply, more than I can put into words." The revelation hit Lily like a punch to the gut. She sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Her mother? This stranger had known her mother. For years, she had clung to the faintest scraps of information about her parents, piecing together a vague image of who they might have been. But now sitting in front of her was someone who had known them, someone who might hold the answers she had been searching for. "What happened to them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan hesitated, a question clearly cutting deep. "Your mother, she was extraordinary, kind, intelligent, full of life. But the world wasn't kind to her. She got caught up in something far bigger than she could handle, and she didn't make it." His voice broke, and he pressed his fingers against his temple, as though trying to keep himself composed. "And my father?" Lily asked, her throat tightening. Ethan looked down, his expression darkening. "I don't know who your father was," he admitted. "Your mother never told me. By the time I found out about you, it was too late. You were already gone, placed in the system." Lily's chest heaved with a mix of emotions, grief, anger, disbelief. "Why didn't you come for me?" she demanded. "If you knew, why didn't you do anything?" Ethan's face twisted with anguish. "I was a coward," he admitted. "I was too wrapped up in my own life, my career. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility, that you'd be better off without me. But the truth is, I was afraid. I thought if I stayed away, I could avoid the guilt, the pain. But it didn't work. Every day I'd thought about you, about what I should have done." Lily felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had spent years building walls around her heart, shielding herself from the pain of abandonment and rejection. Now those walls felt like they were crumbling under the weight of Ethan's words. "So what changed?" she asked bitterly. "Why are you here now? What do you want from me?" Ethan looked up at her, his eyes glistening with tears. "I don't want anything from you, Lily. I want to make things right. I know I can't undo the past, but I'm here now. I want to help you if you'll let me." Lily shook her head, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions coursing through her. "You can't just show up and expect me to forgive you," she said, her voice trembling. "You can't make up for 16 years of nothing." "I know," Ethan said softly. "I don't expect you to forgive me. But please give me a chance to prove that I'm not the same man who walked away all those years ago." The room fell silent, the tension thick and heavy. Lily stared at Ethan, trying to make sense of everything he had told her. Part of her wanted to believe him, to believe that someone cared enough to come back for her. But another part of her, the part that had been hardened by years of disappointment, couldn't ignore the lingering doubts. Mrs. Parker finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "Lily, this is a lot to take in. No one is asking you to make any decisions right now. Take your time to process this. You have every right to feel whatever you're feeling." Lily nodded, grateful for Mrs. Parker's steady presence. She stood, suddenly needing to escape the suffocating weight of the room. "I need some air," she said, her voice barely audible. Ethan started to rise, but Mrs. Parker placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. "Give her space," she said firmly. Meanwhile, Ethan was making his own plans. He knew he couldn't force Lily to trust him, but he also couldn't walk away again. He decided to reach out to Mrs. Parker, hoping she might help him find a way to connect with Lily. When he called the orphanage, Mrs. Parker agreed to meet him for coffee, curious about his intentions. At a small cafe near the city center, Ethan sat nervously, waiting for Mrs. Parker to arrive. When she entered, he stood and offered a polite smile. She returned it, though her expression remained cautious. "Thank you for meeting me," Ethan said as they sat down. "I wasn't sure you'd agree." "I almost didn't," Mrs. Parker admitted. "But I think it's important to hear you out. What do you want from Lily?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want anything from her. I just want to make things right. I know I've hurt her, even if she doesn't fully understand how yet. But I also know I can't undo the past. All I can do is try to be there for her now." Mrs. Parker studied him carefully, trying to gauge his sincerity. "Lily has been through a lot," she said. "She's had to grow up faster than most kids her age, and she's learned not to trust easily. If you really want to help her, you need to be patient. Let her come to you on her terms." Ethan nodded, though the thought of waiting was agonizing. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said earnestly. "I just want her to know she's not alone." Mrs. Parker left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic. Ethan seemed genuine, but she knew actions spoke louder than words. Back at the orphanage, she decided to share the conversation with Lily, hoping it might help her make sense of her feelings. When Mrs. Parker told Lily about her meeting with Ethan, Lily listened intently but remained guarded. "He says he wants to help me," Lily said skeptically. "But how do I know he's not just saying that to make himself feel better?" "You don't have to trust him right away," Mrs. Parker said. "Trust is something that's earned, not given. But maybe it's worth giving him a chance to prove himself." Lily thought about it for a long time. That evening, as she sat in her room, she pulled out the old photograph Ethan had left with her. She traced the edges of the image with her finger, wondering what her mother had been like, and what kind of life she might have had if things had been different. For the first time, she considered the possibility that Ethan might genuinely regret his past mistakes. The next morning, Lily made a decision. She asked Mrs. Parker to arrange another meeting with Ethan. "I'll talk to him," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm not making any promises." When Ethan received the call from Mrs. Parker, relief washed over him. He agreed to meet Lily at a nearby park, hoping the casual setting would make her feel more comfortable. When the day arrived, Ethan arrived early, his nerves on edge. He brought with him a small box, its contents carefully chosen to share a piece of the past he had kept hidden for so long. Lily approached the park bench cautiously, her heart pounding as she saw Ethan waiting for her. He stood as she arrived, offering a tentative smile. "Thank you for coming," he said. Lily nodded, sitting down and keeping a safe distance between them. "I'm here because I want answers," she said bluntly. "Not because I trust you." "I understand," Ethan said, his voice soft. "And I'll do my best to give you the answers you're looking for." He opened the box, revealing a collection of items. A locket, a faded letter, and a small stuffed animal. "These belong to your mother," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She asked me to keep them safe for you. I should have given them to you sooner, but I was too much of a coward." Lily reached for the locket, her fingers trembling as she opened it to reveal a tiny photo of a woman with the same auburn curls and green eyes. She felt a lump rise in her throat as she stared at the image. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of the mother she had always dreamed of knowing. "What's in the letter?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Ethan handed it to her, his hands shaking. "It's from her. She wrote it for you before she passed." Lily unfolded the letter carefully, her eyes scanning the words. Her mother's handwriting was elegant but slightly shaky, as though written in haste. As she read, tears streamed down her face. The letter spoke of love, hope, and a deep regret that she wouldn't be there to see Lily grow up. By the time she finished, Lily's emotions were a storm she couldn't contain. She looked at Ethan, her eyes filled with both anger and pain. "You had this all along," she said, her voice breaking. "Why didn't you give it to me sooner?" Ethan's face crumpled with guilt. "I was selfish," he admitted. "I thought keeping it would somehow ease my guilt. But I was wrong. I'm so sorry, Lily." The rawness of his apology struck a chord in Lily, though she wasn't ready to forgive him. The wounds of her past were too deep, the scars too fresh. But for the first time, she saw a flicker of sincerity in Ethan's eyes, a glimmer of the man he might be trying to become. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the park, Lily stood and clutched the locket tightly. "This doesn't change anything," she said, her voice firm. "But maybe it's a start." Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. It wasn't the resolution he had hoped for, but it was something, a fragile thread connecting them, fragile but unbroken. Days turned into weeks, and while Lily held onto the locket and letter, her feelings toward Ethan remained conflicted. She couldn't deny the sincerity in his voice or the guilt he carried, but years of pain weren't so easily erased. The small gesture of handing over her mother's belongings was just that, a gesture. It didn't make up for the lonely nights, the unanswered questions, or the deep ache of wondering why no one had ever come for her. Ethan, on the other hand, was determined to show Lily that his regret wasn't fleeting. He started visiting the orphanage regularly, not to pressure her but to contribute in ways that might ease her burden. He donated supplies, spent time with the younger children, and even helped Mrs. Parker with overdue repairs around the old building. His actions didn't go unnoticed by Lily, but she kept her distance, watching him from the shadows of the orphanage's hallways. One evening, as Ethan was finishing repairs on a leaky faucet in the kitchen, Lily finally approached him. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with suspicion. Ethan set down his tools and wiped his hands on a rag. "Because I want to help," he said simply. "Not just you, but everyone here. This place gave you a home when I couldn't. It's the least I can do." Lily's eyes narrowed. "You think fixing a sink and buying some supplies will make up for everything?" "No," Ethan said, meeting her gaze. "I know it won't. But I'm not trying to buy your forgiveness. I'm trying to show you that I'm here and I'm not going anywhere this time." Lily didn't respond immediately. She studied him, searching for any sign of insincerity, but found none. Still, trust was something she couldn't summon overnight. "We'll see," she said finally before turning and walking away. As the weeks went on, Ethan's persistence began to chip away at Lily's walls. She started joining him during his visits, though she remained guarded. They worked together on small projects around the orphanage, their conversations tentative but increasingly frequent. For the first time, Lily began to see glimpses of the man he was trying to be, and it stood at something unfamiliar: hope. But just as their fragile connection began to grow, new questions arose. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of old papers in the orphanage's storage room, Lily found a document that stopped her cold. It was a legal file, yellowed with age, bearing her mother's name. Beneath it, another name was listed: Ethan Carter. The section labeled Legal Guardian was stamped with an official seal. Her heart raced as she read the document, her mind reeling. This wasn't just a casual connection. Ethan hadn't been some distant acquaintance of her mother's. He had been legally designated as her guardian. He had known about her existence all along, and for years he had done nothing. Clutching the file, Lily stormed out of the storage room and found Ethan in the courtyard, helping Mrs. Parker trim the hedges. Her voice was sharp and trembling as she confronted him. "You were supposed to be my guardian," she demanded, holding up the document. Ethan froze, his face draining of color. He set down the clippers and turned to her slowly, his expression a mixture of shock and dread. "Lily, I can explain." "Explain what?" she interrupted, her voice rising. "That you abandoned me. That you had a legal obligation to take care of me and you just didn't. How could you do that to me?" Ethan took a step toward her, but she backed away, her anger palpable. "It's not that simple," he said, his voice pleading. "When your mother died, I was a mess. I wasn't in any shape to take care of a child. I thought you'd be better off without me." "Better off?" Lily's voice cracked, her eyes glistening with tears. "Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up thinking no one wants you? To wonder every single day why you weren't good enough for someone to fight for you?" Ethan's shoulders sagged, and he looked at her with a pain that mirrored her own. "You were always good enough," he said quietly. "I was the one who wasn't. I was scared, Lily. Scared of failing you, of not being able to give you the life you deserved. But I see now that I failed you in the worst way possible, by not even trying." Lily's hands trembled as she clutched the document. Every word he spoke chipped away at her defenses, but the weight of his betrayal was too heavy to ignore. "You don't get to decide what's best for me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't get to walk away and then come back when it's convenient for you." "I know," Ethan said, his voice breaking, "and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you if you'll let me. But even if you don't, I'll still be here. I'll still do whatever I can to make your life better because I owe you that much and more." Lily didn't respond. She turned and walked away, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She needed time to process everything to decide whether she could ever let Ethan back into her life. For now all she knew was that the foundation of her world had been shaken, and the answers she had sought for so long had only brought more questions. As the sun set over the orphanage, Ethan remained in the courtyard, staring at the ground. Mrs. Parker approached him cautiously, her expression sympathetic but firm. "You got a long road ahead," she said. "She's been hurt deeply, and it's going to take more than words to heal that." "I know," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm not giving up. Not this time." Inside her room, Lily sat on her bed, the legal documents spread out before her. She traced her mother's name with her finger, her thoughts a tangled web of anger, sadness, and longing. The locket around her neck felt heavier than ever, a symbol of the connection she had lost, and the one she wasn't sure she wanted to rebuild. For now, the only thing she could do was hold onto the pieces and hope that someday she'd be able to make sense of them. Lily sat alone in her room, the dim light from her bedside lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The legal document lay spread out on her bed, but her eyes were fixed on the photograph in the locket. Her mother's face, so familiar yet distant, seemed to be looking right at her. Questions swirled endlessly in her mind, and no matter how hard she tried to make sense of it all, nothing fit neatly. Ethan's words lingered in her thoughts, each one chipping away at her resolve to keep him at arm's length. But then, as she traced her mother's image once more, a sudden thought struck her, a memory she had long buried. Her mother had once mentioned a name. She couldn't remember the exact details, but it had been during one of their fleeting conversations, before life had grown impossibly hard. The name wasn't Ethan's, but it was connected to someone powerful. Lily's chest tightened as the fragmented memory began to piece itself together. There was someone else in the picture, someone her mother had trusted, but who had disappeared just as Ethan had. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. If Ethan was supposed to be her legal guardian, then who was this other person her mother had spoken of, and why had her mother seemed so afraid when mentioning him? Unable to sit still, Lily grabbed the locket and the document and marched downstairs. Ethan was still in the courtyard, sitting on the edge of a bench, his head in his hands. He looked up as she approached, the faint hope in his eyes faltering as he saw her expression. Before he could speak, Lily thrust the document at him. "There's someone else," she said, her voice firm but trembling. "My mom mentioned another name before she died. Who is it?" Ethan's face darkened, his jaw tightening as he averted his gaze. For a moment, he said nothing, and the silence only fueled Lily's frustration. "Answer me," she demanded, her voice rising. "You said you wanted to make things right. Start by telling me the truth." Ethan let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. "Lily," he began, his voice low, "there's a lot you don't know about your mother's past, and about mine. The name you're remembering, it's not just someone she mentioned in passing. He was dangerous." Lily's heart pounded in her chest. "Dangerous? What does that mean? Who is he?" Ethan hesitated before finally speaking. "His name is Gerald Kane. He was a business partner of mine. Well, more like a rival. We worked in the same industry, but he played dirty. Your mother got caught in the middle of it. She didn't know what she was walking into when she met him, and by the time she realized, it was too late. Gerald had a way of controlling people, manipulating them. Your mother tried to break free, but he didn't take rejection lightly." Lily felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you saying he hurt her?" Ethan nodded grimly. "He threatened her life. That's why she came to me. She was desperate to protect you, and I promised I'd help. But when she—" His voice broke, and he took a moment to compose himself. "When she passed away, I was supposed to take care of you. But Gerald wasn't going to let that happen easily. He made it clear that if I got involved, he'd come after both of us. I thought staying away would keep you safe." Lily's hands trembled as she absorbed his words. "So, you left me to face everything alone because you were scared of him." "I was scared for you," Ethan said, his voice filled with anguish. "I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that I was just being a coward. I should have fought for you, Lily. I should have stood up to him." Lily looked away, her emotions a tangled mess of anger, fear, and confusion. She wanted to scream at Ethan for his failures, but a part of her couldn't ignore the weight of his confession. If what he said was true, then her mother's death wasn't just a tragic accident. It was tied to something far more sinister. "Where is he now?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan hesitated again, and that hesitation told her everything she needed to know. "He's still out there," he admitted. "I kept tabs on him over the years. He's powerful, but he's also untouchable. At least, that's what he wants everyone to believe." Lily's mind raced. If Gerald Kane was still alive, then there were answers he held, answers about her mother, about her own past, and perhaps even about why Ethan had been so afraid to step in. But confronting him was a risk, and the thought of stepping into the orbit of someone so dangerous made her stomach churn. "I need to know the truth," she said finally, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "I can't keep living with all these questions. If Gerald knows something, then I have to confront him." "No," Ethan said firmly, rising to his feet. "You don't know what you're getting into, Lily. He's not someone you can just walk up to and demand answers from. He'll twist everything, use it against you. I won't let you put yourself in danger. You don't get to decide that, Lily shot back. You've had years to stand up to him, and you didn't. Now it's my turn. Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but the determination in Lily's eyes stopped him. He saw in her the same fire that had driven her mother, a fire that couldn't be extinguished, no matter how dire the circumstances. Reluctantly, he nodded. You're going to do this? He said. Then you're not doing it alone. I'll help you, but we have to be smart about it. Lily's heart pounded as she nodded in agreement. The stakes had never been higher, and the path ahead was fraught with danger. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was within reach, and she was determined to uncover it, no matter what it took.